Djibouti is a very small country in a very important strategic position. For a start, it provides a route to the sea for its huge landlocked neighbor Ethiopia, a demanding and uncomfortable journey through a dry and inhospitable landscape. But Ethiopia is not the only foreign country interested in Djibouti.
One of my Marine colleagues said, "My God, if they put another single soldier or Marine on Djibouti, it'll sink."
Because in some ways, Djibouti is the Africom headquarters that never was. It began as a naval expeditionary camp in 2003 as part of the global war on terror. Its position at the heart of the Horn of Africa could not be more strategic, with Somalia, Ethiopia and Sudan on the African side, and across the water, the Middle East. But since 2007, it has grown significantly in size, expanding from 88 acres to nearly 500. It is now the US's largest permanent camp in Africa. From these offices, CJT HOA, as it's known, the Combined Joint Task Force Horn of Africa, carries out Africom's mission in this entire area of Africa.
Well, the initial mission of the Combined Joint Task Force was very counterterrorism focused, and went from that very direct approach at countering terrorism to what we have today is a very indirect approach to countering violent extremism.
In a village outside Djibouti town, an example of this indirect approach, where American military construction specialists known as Seabees were rebuilding a school roof. As an exercise in winning hearts and minds, it was undoubtedly successful.
Qu'est-ce que vous pensez les soldats américains? Merci beaucoup.
Education, health, development are all convincingly a part of Camp Lemonier's mission. But this is a military operation, and key to that is military-to-military training.
You make a difference.
But of course, that can be very politically sensitive.
You know, most of these militaries are attempting to cause their security structures to be seen as structures that protect their people as opposed to oppress their people. And so that requires a degree of continued professionalization of their military forces.
The difficulty for General Ward and his command is that they cannot control what those armies then do with that training.
See, here's the question. When Africom talks about we are stabilizing countries across the continent, who exactly are they stabilizing? Are they stabilizing the government that's in power? Is the government in power representative of the interests of the people? And the answer across the continent, most people on the ground will tell you, is absolutely not.
These leaders are assuming, really, that by building up their militaries, they will be able to sustain their power and sustain their regimes. This is not necessarily something that's in the best interest of the people, right? And it's often really that, you know, democracy is the first target, the first victim, and innocent civilians follow.
Indeed, in 2008 in Mauritania, the army, which had received US training, went on to overthrow the democratically elected president and take power itself.
While you cite examples of where it has not gone right, there are many where it has gone correctly, whereby the military has stayed apolitical, has been seen as protectors of its people, and I think that too is something that ought to be understood.
So which armies have stayed apolitical, as General Ward puts it? It's actually surprisingly difficult to say. You'd be hard-pushed to describe the Rwandan army as apolitical. Disciplined and brave, certainly, but still fiercely loyal to the government and party it put in power by force in 1994. And that also applies to another of the neighboring countries with which the US has established close relations. 1,500 kilometers to the southwest of Djibouti, Uganda. A relationship which raises some of the most difficult questions about Africom's whole mission. Uganda has been ruled for nearly a quarter of a century by one party under President Yoweri Museveni. He and his rebel force, the National Resistance Army, seized power in 1986, ending decades of terror under the despotic regimes of Idi Amin and Milton Obote. But today there are growing concerns about Museveni's increasingly autocratic rule and growing restrictions on political freedom. In 2008, Museveni provoked international condemnation by changing the constitution so he could stand indefinitely for president. In July 2009, US President Obama spoke for the first time in sub-Saharan Africa.
And make no mistake, history is on the side of these brave Africans, not with those who use coups or change constitutions to stay in power. Africa doesn't need strong men, it needs strong institutions.
Despite these fine words, the US continues to train and work closely with Museveni's army, Ugandan People's Defense Force. Major Felix Kulaija is the UPDF spokesman.
They have helped us in building capability to build the peace and stability in this country. Now, once you build that local capacity, then the local military is transformed like ours, which has a guerrilla background, to a professional military that is indeed neutral, but not apolitical. So that's where the difference, where we parted with other people.
So while General Ward insists that the armies they work with should remain apolitical, the spokesman for the UPDF insists their army is indeed political. In effect, openly and proudly an arm of Museveni's ruling party, the National Resistance Movement.
This is a partisan army, an army that supports only the president and actually does not see itself as a separate arm of the state from the executive. It is organized and run in a manner as to protect the regime. They believe that with the support of a powerful country like America, they can live much longer than if they didn't have this support. And of course, America, they also believe that these regimes are fairly vulnerable without the military, without the coercive arms of the state. So there is that mutuality of interest as far as the regimes are concerned.
So with both its critics and its supporters describing the UPDF as a political army loyal to one political party, you might expect the US to be very wary of any involvement. Yet it was with the UPDF that Africom first became involved, albeit indirectly, in a full-on combat operation, a conflict with a complex history. For more than 20 years, northern Uganda has endured a terrible war, waged by a rebel force called the Lord's Resistance Army, under the command of a dangerous mystic called Joseph Kony. Since 1987, the LRA has abducted thousands of children, forcing them to join their ranks and terrorize their own communities with acts of unspeakable brutality and torture, commonly cutting off the hands, lips, noses, and ears of their victims. No one knows how many have died, but millions were displaced into huge and dangerous camps, which were themselves often attacked. There is no doubt that the LRA, part cult, part ruthless army, is a very difficult enemy, and the UPDF, often accused itself of acts of barbarity and repression, has failed over 20 years to end the insurrection. Indeed, the last two major military drives against the LRA had catastrophic consequences, dispersing them across the country and seriously escalating the violence. But northern Uganda was seen as an area with few resources and little strategic value, and for years the world seemed hardly to notice the suffering of the people, until recently. The United States has become much more interested, and some suggest the reason for that interest was not as honorable as it may seem.
American interest in helping Uganda deal with the Lord's Resistance Army is very recent, and it has everything to do with the situation in Sudan, particularly southern Sudan.
This part of Africa is an area of complex and interconnected struggles. Uganda's neighbor to the north is Sudan, and for over 20 years that country too had been riven by civil war. But the war in Sudan ended in 2005. For the time being, the peace is holding, and that has led to renewed interest in the region because Sudan has oil.
Following the end of the war in Sudan, it became clear that it was now possible in peace to exploit the resources in southern Sudan, particularly oil. So anybody disturbing the peace between Uganda and Sudan was a problem to that project. And therefore, it became necessary to ensure that the LRA was stopped.
And now, to create even more interest in the area, significant amounts of oil have been found in Uganda itself. I decided to put a blunt proposition to Uganda's Minister for International Affairs, Henry Oryema-Kello.
The Americans are very keen on dismantling the LRA because of the threat to the economic interests in this region, oil and minerals.
Possibly. Possibly.
Probably.
Probably. Why not? We're very satisfied with that relationship, but no doubt that there are people within the hierarchy or within in government who are suspicious that yes, the Americans are here not to help us out of the situation, but to make sure they protect the developing oil fields that are emerging in this region.
And the LRA would have disrupted that. I mean, it could have threatened those interests.
If the LRA were left to own devices, the LRA could cause a regional disaster in this region. And that, if it had happened, it could have disrupted, as you said, the interests of many parties.
And as the interests of those other parties grew, things did change dramatically. 2008 was when Africom became embroiled, albeit indirectly, in its first war.